Over the past 4 months now, we've been in a study of Genesis, and we've been just in the first 4 chapters, and that's a long time in a couple chapters of the Bible. And there's a reason that we've spent so much time here, because the book of Genesis, especially there in the beginning, is teaching us not only about God's creation, but also about his design, about the way that we are designed and the way that our world is designed. In fact, think of it this way. If you think of the word Genesis, think about that. Is there another English word that is similar to that word? Can you think of any? Let me give you one that's almost identical. Genetics. It's the same root word. It's the same word. And it is because it's talking about the same thing. You see, when we think about the book of Genesis, it's giving us a description of our, in a sense, spiritual genetics, our DNA. In Genesis 1 and 2, we spent a lot of time looking there, and we see God's design. We see the way that God has designed us, not only biologically, but morally, and family structure, and gender, and work, all those things. And we saw that the more that we understand his design, the more we align ourselves with that design, the healthier we are, because we're living consistent with our DNA. But now as we're looking at Genesis 3 and 4, we're also seeing not only the origin of sin, but the impact of sin, how it actually becomes part of our nature, that we inherit this sin nature, that in a sense it has invaded our DNA, it's invaded our spiritual code. So we're not only looking at what happened to our earliest forefathers, we're looking at the nature of sin and what it's teaching about ourselves. And not only that, but we're also seeing even here in Genesis 1 through 4, the story of God's grace. That it's not just about God saying, okay, you've fallen, and when we fall in, that God just writes us off and rejects us, but from the very beginning of the human story, from the very beginning of sin, Genesis is telling us the story of God's pursuing us. That's the video that we saw there in the beginning. And so let's see how that plays out this morning as we look at this well-known story of Cain and Abel, the first murder in human history. Now, again, as we look at it, we've got to realize that we're not just looking at Cain's sin, we're actually looking at how sin works in our lives, how it works in our spiritual genetics. And part of that starts by seeing the source of sin. Where does it come from in our own hearts? Let's go to Genesis. If you have your Bibles, verses 1 and 2. We read, now, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain was a worker of the ground. So Adam and Eve were told about here 2 sons that they have, and as they grow to adulthood, one grows up to be a shepherd, the other one grows up to be a farmer. And then we read in verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain, his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. Now we read that, and right away we say, what in the world's going on here? What are these offerings that they're talking about? And why is it that God had regard for Abel and not for Cain? And why did this make Cain so angry? Now it seems a little confusing. I actually have heard numerous people, pastors and teachers, have a whole bunch of different teachings on this. And as I've studied it, let me share with you what I think that it's saying. Both Cain and Abel here come to God and they bring an offering. Now, in the Hebrew language, there are numerous words for offerings. And we often think of like a sin offering. Later on, it's like, well, you offer the sin to cover for sin, or an offering to cover your sin. That's not the word that's used here. It's a specific word for a dedication offering. And a dedication offering is something not about offering for forgiveness, but it's a way of coming and saying, God, I'm going to give something to you that belongs to me, not only as a gift, but as a symbol of me giving myself. Now that sounds confusing, but it's actually something that's very close to what we do in our time and our culture. Okay, so think of it this way. This isn't us and God, it's actually in our relationships. When a man comes to a woman and he asks her to marry him, he generally brings an offering. He brings a ring. It's a valuable gift. It's a valuable symbol that he's not only saying, I'm giving this gift, but I'm giving it as a symbol that I'm going to give my whole self to you. And so think about it. These rings are really valuable. You know what this looks like. I might think about even in my own story, and when I asked my wife to marry me, I'd saved money, and we saved for the ring, and with this whole plan, I had this, put the ring on a little teddy bear, and I got these balloons, and we were going to have somebody float the teddy bear down from the second story of an outdoor mall, and it's really, really romantic. Unless the wind comes and takes the balloons and floats it away, and suddenly I'm saying, my ring. No, I was worried about that. It didn't happen. But the thing is you're worried about that because it's expensive. But it's not just the expense of the ring. It's what it symbolizes. That's what's most significant. And think of it this way. We know this to be the case. So let's say what happened if a man goes out and he gets a very, very expensive ring, and he comes to his girlfriend and he says, will you marry me? And he gives the ring. But what if the night before she found out that he's been sleeping with multiple other women? How's she going to respond? Probably not, oh, wow, thank you. No, probably it's going to be, are you kidding me? This isn't love, this is bribery. You found out that I found out, so now you're trying to say, how do I buy you off? No, I want love. I want what's real. I want not just the ring, I want what it symbolizes. If you aren't willing to give me all of you, you can't buy me off. Forget about it. And if you had a woman that came and said, this guy asked me, and that was the story, that's what we would tell her to do. Run away from him. Now, if we understand that when it comes to human relationships, if we understand someone will give a gift that symbolizes something, meanwhile it's an empty promise, how do you think that God responds to us when we do the same thing to him? When we come to him and we say, God, here's my promise, here's how much I love you, but he looks at us and our life doesn't match up at all. See, when we come to God, we can come and we can worship and we can sing and we can give generous gifts, and if it's not backed up by our lives, see, that's not true love. That's not commitment. Often it's actually bribery. It's kind of saying, okay, God, I want to do my own thing, but what do I have to do to earn your favor? What do I have to do to earn your approval? And that's what we're doing. That's what's going on here with Cain and Abel. Both are bringing a dedication offering. Cain was a farmer, so he brings from his crops, from his income. Abel was a shepherd. He brought from his income some of his sheep. But even in this, I want to point something out, even here in Genesis. What does it say? Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. He's coming and bringing the best. In a sense, Cain is coming saying, what do I need to give? Is this enough? He's just doing what is expected. Abel's offering from his heart. There's another passage that helps us understand it. Hebrews 11, it says this, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, which through which he was commended as being righteous, as God commended him by accepting his gifts. So Abel gave it in faith. What's that mean? I believe we go back to Genesis 3. He's looking at it and saying, God has promised to take care of my sin problem. And he believed that, and he's given now in faith in response to God, out of gratitude, out of love. Now, Abel is not giving in faith. So why is he giving it? And I think when we look at that, well, what's your other motive? I think it's to earn God's blessing. God, what do I have to do? It's the spirit of religion. How do I perform? How do I earn your favor? And so God looks at the two of them, and he's able to tell this heart difference. And that's when it talks about, that he didn't have regard for Cain's offering. I think it meant that Cain realized that God wasn't blessing him. He didn't have God's pleasure and God's blessing. And so what happened is he became angry. And he's looking at Abel, and God's blessing Abel. And he's not only depressed and angry, he's jealous. But all of it comes from wrong beliefs about God. Why? Because Cain is thinking, well, if I just do the right things, then God owes me. And then if God doesn't, well, my lack of happiness, my frustration, well, it's because God has failed to give me what I deserve, what I need. If you think about it, what Cain is doing here is very consistent with what his parents did in Genesis 3. Why? Because Adam and Eve, like Cain, like them, he's believing God hasn't given me what I need. God hasn't given me what I need to be happy. If I'm not happy, it's God's fault. And then he blames his sin on someone else. It's not my problem, it's, well, Abel and what he has done. And he doesn't take responsibility. And God tells him in verse 7, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Meaning, don't you realize, Cain, if you're facing consequences, it's because of your decisions. And if you do what's well, then I'm going to bless you. But if you don't, it's because of your decisions. But he's not willing to take responsibility. He's blaming God. He's blaming his brother. And his solution isn't to take personal responsibility. It's basically to blame someone else and let me get rid of the problem that's keeping me from being happy. So that's what we see happening as we go through the story. But first, before we even go to there, let's see how God intervenes. In verse 6 and 7, God knows that Cain is angry and depressed, and he comes to confront him. And he says, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Now, God is saying some incredibly vivid and symbolic things about the nature of sin and temptation here. Starting with the hiddenness of sin. Again, in verse 7, when God warns Cain, and if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door. Now, the Hebrew word he used here for crouching is a word that is always used to describe wild beasts. Think of lions and tigers, big cats. And think about a cat, how they crouch. They, in a sense, they crouch. They sneak up on their prey before pouncing. Now, I've never lived in a place where they have lions and tigers. I haven't seen that in person. I've never had a cat, and so I haven't seen that even with smaller cats. They do the same thing. So my understanding of this comes more from movies. When my kids were young, their favorite movie, the big movie out at that time was Lion King. And I think of the imagery in the movie The Lion King where the father, Mufasa, tries to teach his young cub, Simba, how to pounce.
The baboons are going ape.
What are you doing, son?
Of course, the giraffes are acting like
Pouncing.
Let an old pro show you how it's done.
I told the elephants to forget it, but they can't.
Zazu, would you turn around?
Yes, sire. The cheetahs are hard up.
Stay
but,
low
I
to
always
the ground.
Cheetahs never prosper.
Okay, stay low to the ground, right? Yeah.
What's going on?
A pouncing lesson.
Oh, very good. Pouncing. Pouncing? Oh, no, sire, you can't be serious. Oh, this is so humiliating.
Try not to make a sound.
What are you telling him, Mufasa? Mufasa? Simba?
That's very good.
Now, it wasn't only my kids' favorite movie. They loved that scene, so much so that we invented pouncing games that we played throughout the preschool years. And so when I think of pouncing, I always go to that scene. Now, what does it say? When you think of that picture, you think of a predatory cat. And what is it doing when it's crouching? What's hiding from view? Like in Lion King, Mufasa is teaching Simba, in a sense, to disappear into the grass. Don't let the prey see you. And what God is telling Cain, and he's telling us in the same way, sin seeks to hide in our own lives so that we don't see it. God's coming to Cain and saying, there's this great danger that's going on in your life, and you don't even see it as a problem. You need to be aware of it. And God says the same thing to us. So often we can have anger in our, well, I'm not angry, and it's righteous indignation. It's, we can look at this and boy, my fixation on material things, well, I'm just being responsible. Or I've seen people even move into an inappropriate relationship with someone of the opposite sex. And, well, God brought this person in my life. Oh, they're a supportive friend. And we totally ignore the danger that's there, even calling it good. And so much so that there are many areas of sin that the Bible calls sin that many people in our culture celebrate as a good thing. And many in the church have even embraced that as well. And we become blind to sin and temptation as it's crouching, it's hiding in our lives. Sometimes it may not completely hide, but it's making itself small. And so again, you think of that crouching cat, it's in the corner, it's just sneaking up, and it looks like it's small. See, in our lives, all of us know that we have things that need to be fixed. We have problems that aren't quite right. But the question is, are they minor flaws or are they big problems? And a lot of times what we say, no, I know I have a flaw. I know I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't nurse that grudge. I probably shouldn't have that attitude. I know I shouldn't look at all the, some of the stuff on social media or some of the internet. It's not all that, it's not the best, but it's not a big deal. Everybody else is doing it. And that's sin that is crouching down. And we have to ask in our own lives, what's crouching in your life? What's hiding? Do you know? And if you don't know, then you're really in danger. And if you do know, what are you willing to do about it? Well, let's go back to God's warning. He's not only warning us that it's crouching, but it's crouching because it is a predator that will in time pounce. I like the way that the New Living Translation translates verse 7. It says this, "But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at your door. It's eager to control you, but you must subdue it and be its master." It's ready to pounce. It wants to control. It's a predator. And we've got to realize the predatory nature of this sin. Think of a predator. It always crouches for a reason. The reason it crouches is it's hunting. I think about that scene from The Lion King where you have, Mufasa's training Simba and he crouches and then they laugh about it and we say, oh, that's great, and we're going to let the bird go. That doesn't happen in real life. That's only in cartoons. In real life, if the cat pounces and it catches you, it devours you. It's always for a reason, for hunting, for devouring. And what we need to realize is that sin will hide, but it is hiding for the purpose of pouncing, of attacking, and it always will. When God warns us that sin is crouching at the door, he's warning us that it's doing so for the purpose of attacking us. It crouches out in a way of saying, I'm not that big, I'm just sitting here in a corner. But again, sin never sits. It crouches for the purpose of pouncing, of attacking, of taking over our lives. And my friends, we need to realize that in our own lives, if we leave sin alone, and we just say, okay, so, we're not going to make a big deal, and it's going to eventually turn on us. I think about the whole issue. What if, I've got that thing. It's not a big deal. It's just a grudge. I'm not that angry. It's not a big deal. And it's not real bitterness. But what happens? Ephesians 4 warns us that if we hold bitterness in our heart, that it's a stronghold by which Satan uses to attack us on multiple fronts. It's the idea that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, where he said, okay, you all know that murder is wrong. Well, but you think that anger is okay. And look at what Jesus says. If you've heard it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to the judgment. It's not just the murder, it's when you're when you're letting the predator in, because eventually it's going to attack. The same thing, he goes a few verses later, the whole issue of lust and desire. We may look at that and we say, well, I know that relationship isn't great. I know what I'm some of the habit of pornography. It's a small thing. Look at what Jesus says. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Oh, we know that's wrong. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And Jesus is saying, be aware of the reality of this. It's not just the big sins, it's the little things, because they are big things that are crouching down. It's a predator that is sneaking up while it's making its attack. And if we're not careful, it will attack. And he warns us it will attack not only to devour, but to seek to control us. So when God says in verse 7, sin is crouching at your door, its desire is to have you. In the New Living, its desire is to control you, but you must master it. What he's saying is in the early stages of sin and temptation, we may seem to have some control over things. So again, in the early stages of an inappropriate relationship, or in early stages of bitterness, or pride, or the early stages of greed, and any kind of addiction, in the early stages, it's like, I'm playing with this, I can control it. You still have some control. You do, but what happens when you give into that sin? Before long, you lose control. And the Bible talks about us becoming a slave to sin. And suddenly that inappropriate relationship suddenly is controlling us. Suddenly our anger is controlling us. Suddenly our pride is controlling us. Because it's not just a matter of choosing a wrong action. It's making a choice that actually empowers the sin. Because when we sin, it actually creates a force in our life. It empowers this predator and that seeks to control us. That's why God says he's not metaphorical when he says it wants to have you. It wants to control you. Some of you may have seen this saying before, and I think it's so applicable here about just the nature of sin. It says, sin will always take you further than you wanted to go, keep you longer than you wanted to stay, and cost you more than you wanted to pay. That's the reality. And we've got to be honest about that. We can't lie to ourselves. Yes, initially it's a choice, but it's a power. It starts as a choice that we can control, but it will quickly devour our soul and become a power that controls us. And that's God's warning to Cain. It's his warning to us. Now, I'll tell you, that's up till now, this is a dark story, and it is. About not only the attack that we have, and then if we go and we see Cain ignoring that, you see him killing his brother. But I want you to also see, even in this story, there's also hope. Because in this story, there's also a statement about God's grace. But first of all, we see God's grace in temptation. Now think about this. When you think about the story, when does God first come to Cain? After Cain kills his brother? No. No, God looks at Cain and he sees, while it tells us that he was downcast, that he was angry, God looks at his heart before he's done anything wrong. When Cain still thinks this is just a small thing, God looks there and he sees that sin crouching, and he comes and he challenges him while he still has the ability to make a good decision, to master it. And in the same way, God, by his grace, will challenge us, not just after we've sinned, but he will challenge us even beforehand. He will try to show us the danger. He will try to come to us in the temptation and offer a way out. He exposes our core need. Even when God comes to Cain, he doesn't come as a judge. He doesn't say, how dare you be angry? He doesn't come as a teacher. Here's what's doing wrong. He comes as a counselor. I love the way that God does it. What does he do? He doesn't tell Cain, he asks. What does he do? He says, why are you angry? Let me ask you, why does God ask that question of Cain? Did God not know? Is God looking at it and saying, Cain, you kind of look angry today. What's going on in your life? I'm kind of curious. No, God knew. God knew what was going on. God knew, but Cain didn't. And so what God does as a counselor is he goes to Cain and he's trying to get him to look at his own life. Cain, why are you angry? And you're going to blame other people. You're going to blame me. The real problem isn't them, it's you. See, and applied to us, we've got to look at the own hidden sins in our life, and we need to see them as not something small, but as a crouching predator. And then we've got to ask, what is behind that? What is behind my anger? What is behind my lust? Why am I so discontent? Why do I feel the need to be accepted by other people? Why am I so driven by performance? Even as we look at this, there's a lot of reason people speculate exactly why Cain was angry. And I've seen a lot of different ideas on that. The more I've studied it, I really think that God leaves it intentionally vague. You know why? Because if we would say, well, here's why he's angry, and this is what happened, and this is what he believed, I might look at that and say, well, that's interesting. It doesn't apply to me. But when I look at this, what God, I think, is saying to us is that we have to look at our own heart. Why are you angry? It may not be the same reason as Cain. Why are you discontent? Why are you struggling with that? He's trying to expose the inner attitudes that aren't right. It's warning, it's a crouching predator. And we have to ask ourselves, what is behind this? Now, the problem we may come, well, it's the other person. It's my brother. It's my spouse. It's difficult. It's my situation. And what God's trying to say is, no, I'm trying to look at you. May we have circumstances that have contributed to our problems? Yes, we do. All of us have stories that include brokenness. But the problem isn't the circumstance, it's our response to the circumstance. And God's asking to us, why are you angry? Why are you discovering, or why are you struggling with this? Here's where I want to encourage you. For some of us, if you're really asking that question and you're not sure, that's a value of Christian counseling. Of going and getting somebody else and saying, I feel like there's that predator and it's hiding well enough I can't see it. Ask other people for help you to be able to see that and then deal with it. And notice God also says, but you must master it. And he's telling us that it says, okay, you're going to face this, and I'm going to give you the ability by grace to not only see it, but then to master it. To not only resist the temptation. What is the lie? The lie is, if you have, its desire is to have you. That's your desire. You got to act on your desire. We saw this back several weeks ago. And that's the lie of our culture. You want this, you think this, you feel that, you think this is who I am. And no, you are more than your desires. The culture is saying if you feel something, you got to act on it. No, we are created in God's image. We are more than our desires. And we need to learn to reject wrong desires, to see the truth and to master them. And God gives us that ability. I love what it says in 1 Corinthians. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. This stuff in their DNA we see all the way back in Genesis 4. And God is faithful and will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. It may be more than you can handle on your own, but it will never be more than you can handle if you rely on God's grace. And are you willing to look at that? Are you willing to see that as a problem? So we need to see it and then have that wise response to that grace. Because if we see sin and temptation as a predator, what should we do? Well, what we need to do is we need to say, hey, if you've got something that's trying to destroy your life, don't keep it in the corner. Attack it. Deal with it. If it's cancer, get rid of it. Look at what Colossians 3 says about this. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which idolatry. And if we see something that's a sin, take it out. It's seeking to destroy you. So a lot of times when we look at this, we may have a sense of, do we hate the sin in your life? Sometimes it's like, man, I hate the consequence. I hate the guilt. Do you hate the sin? Do you hate the thought of the sin? So a lot of times we may look at this and say, well, I don't like the consequence of getting angry, but I like holding a grudge against the other person. I don't like the consequence of getting caught in an inappropriate relationship, but I like the relationship. I know it's wrong to gossip, but it feels good. And the thing is, are we willing to admit it before God? Not just it's wrong, but I see it as it's wrong. I hate it like God hates it. Am I willing to let God kill it? The problem is a lot of times we don't, because we don't see it as a predator, we see it as a pet. And we look at this and we say, well, here's the cat, and I've tamed it, and it's not that big, and we see it as crouching, but it's not crouching, it's just not that bad. Every once in a while you read a story of someone who has gotten, usually it's a tiger. You think of Tiger King as this big thing of, the show about it. But somebody gets a tiger and they raise it as a pet. They're convinced that it's tamed. They're convinced it's safe. And so they have their kids snuggle with their pet tiger. They even have babies that learn to ride on the tiger, and they bring it in their home. It's a great pet. It's house trained. And well, maybe it's not totally house trained, but they try to do that. It's a pet. Now the reality is, if you read a story like that, it's almost always because the pet turned. You read the story when you hear about the pet who turned on the master and killed the master, or turned on a child and devoured a child. And you see a couple of them every year, because people say, oh, it's a pet. No, it's a dangerous animal. It's a predator. That's what they do. Predators by nature cannot be ultimately tamed. There's something in their nature that will kill. And so, we've got to realize in our own life, we can have this sin and we can think, it's under control, I've got it, and it's a pet, and I don't like the consequence, but I can control it. And until we see it as a predator and we say, God, I need to kill it, I need you to kill it, I need you to change my desires, help me to not only hate the action, but help me to hate the thought of it. Until we become radical in that way, you see, we're gonna let it crouch in the corner and not realize that what we think is safe is anything but safe. Now, ideally, we do that before it pounces, before it devours us, before it controls us. But what if it's after? What if like Cain, we don't listen to God, and next thing you know, suddenly we've acted in anger and it's done great damage? Well, even here, I want you to see that there's grace of God in sin. Now let me go back to verse 8. Cain spoke to his brother Abel. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. First, I want you to see that even here we see God's grace in his exposing sin. You know what I love? Even here, when God comes and approaches Cain, he doesn't come and start with, what have you done? Here's the consequences. What does he start with? He asks a question. Where's your brother Abel? Why is he asking the question? Again, does God not know? So why is he asking the question? Not because God wants knowledge from Cain, but God's trying to invite Cain to expose himself to God, to, in a sense, acknowledge and confess. It's an attempt to speak to Cain's conscience. He wants him to bring to a point of confessing his sin so he can be forgiven. And my friends, what we need to realize is no matter what you've done, and even if you've given in, and no matter what you've done, there may be consequences. And we're going to see that there are consequences for what we've done earthly, but we can know God's grace and forgiveness. There's never a place where God says, you are beyond hope. He comes to us in grace. Will we accept that grace? Unfortunately, Cain did not. And what we see is something of our natural response to God's truth. In verse 10, the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today from the ground, from your face, and I shall be hidden. I will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. Now let me ask you, did Cain have sorrow for his sin? Is there sorrow here? There's sorrow for the consequence. There's nothing in there, God, I sin against you, nothing of regret about with his brother. It's like, God, I can't handle the consequence. I'm caught and I don't like the punishment. There's sorrow for the consequence, but not for the sin. And a lot of times that's our natural response if we get caught. Oh, I didn't repent because I wanted to. I got repented just because I got caught, and I'm repenting because I'm trying to undo the consequences, but I still like the sin. In fact, we're going to see what happens at the very end, what happens is Cain leaves the presence of God. He sets up a town, we're going to see next week, in his own name, in his son's name, and it's defined by his rebellion. And the consequences on him, and not only him, but his descendants are incredible. We're going to see that next week. But that's the wrong response. It may at times look right. See, but God doesn't just want our tears for what we've done and the consequences. He wants our tears for who we are, for the core. And see, what we need is the right response, the restorative response to God's grace. Unfortunately, in this story, we don't see it because Cain rejected God. But the Bible is filled with stories who did things very similar to Cain. And when God came and said, what have you done? He asked the questions that they responded in confession. In fact, you want a couple really big names that we all know? How about David, who killed Bathsheba's husband, who committed adultery, did incredible evil things. And God sent somebody, a prophet, and said, what have you done? And he repented. And God not only forgave him, there were consequences, but God forgave him and used him. Or how about Paul, the apostle? And here's a guy that killed people, that persecuted the church, and God met him on the road and said, Paul, what are you doing? And God asked him the question, and he was willing to acknowledge that, and he repented, and God not only forgave him, but God used him. My friends, what we need to realize is that no matter where you're at, God isn't here exposing you to reject you. He's exposing to forgive. It's always an invitation of grace. And are you willing to respond? The fact of the matter is that all of us have sins that are crouching in our lives. All of us have at times even given in to that. And I don't say that condemningly of anyone else. I say that myself included. As it talks about in 1 John, if we claim that we have no sin, we're only fooling ourselves and not living in the truth. All of us have sin. We deny that, we're lying. But we not only see that sin, but we see that God is confronting us to show us grace. And what we see is that God calls us not to respond like Cain and just to deny it or to reject or just to be sorry about the consequences, but to ultimately come to him and say, God, I agree with you, like a David, like a Paul. Because what does he promise in the next verse in 1 John? If we confess our sins to him, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all wickedness. My friends, no matter where you're at here today, that's God's invitation. We all struggle. I hope that when we look at this, it's not just Cain's story. This is our DNA. This is how sin works in our life. And Satan's going to work, and he's going to take it, and he's going to hide, and it's crouching in our life. Do you know what's crouching in your life? Do you know what's there? Do you see it? Are you making it small, or are you willing to acknowledge for what it is? And God's, by grace, challenging us. When he's calling us to say, see what it is, turn it over to me, let me help you, and reject it and deal with it as an ultimate threat, and he will show you the grace to do that. But even if it's beyond that point and you've said, but I've given in, and man, I'm so ashamed, and boy, there's brokenness in relationships, and today is the day to come and say, God, I want to get this right. I don't want to double down on it like Cain and run away and continue to experience brokenness. Today is the day that God says, no, I'm still pursuing you, not to reject you, not to write you off, but to say there can be healing. May there be consequences? Yes, but there can be healing and there can be restoration. That's God's invitation to each one of us here today. So how do you respond? Is he seeking out to you? If you've never trusted in Christ as your Lord and Savior, I'd invite you to do so even here. Just to say, God, I acknowledge, I ask you to forgive me through what Jesus Christ has done. Because the whole story of the gospel is not only about how he's made us and our design and our DNA and our sin, but it's also about God's grace and his pursuit of us to forgive us and to restore us into relationship with him.
If you have a question about the message, Community Church, or Jesus Christ, send us a text to 330-400-3242. You can learn more about our events and community groups at ccpl.life/connect. There you can also send in a prayer request. We would love to pray for you. Have a blessed Lord's Day, and we'll see you on Sunday.